And so I'd like to begin with a quote. "History aptly demonstrates that special privileges for one group can but result in the limitation of liberty and the denial of rights to others." That's from a congressman by the name of J. Lister Hill, and he made that quote in 1964 in the midst of the historic debates about whether or not the Civil Rights Act would pass. And so today, we recognize the 85th birthday of Dr. King. We also recognize the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, which did indeed pass. And so in thinking about Dr. King today, I thought about the many identities that he held, that of a civil rights leader, that of a human rights leader, that as a clergy member, that as an African American, that of a citizen, but also something that we hardly think of him as, and that is as a victim of gun violence. So Dr. King's death, in the tragic context in which it occurred in the 1960s, is understood as part of the trio of assassinations that defined the decade, that of John F. Kennedy, and also Robert F. Kennedy, and that of Dr. King. And two fundamental changes came out of the death of Dr. King. And I would like to talk about those changes and what happened, the change that happened to that change. So, as a victim of gun violence, as a man who was assassinated in his prime at 39 years old, it forced the country to reckon with the question of who are we and what is the nature of our society, that an individual who brings a message of peace has his life ended so tragically and so violently. In the wake of his death, Congress passed a historic law that would ban the sale of weapons, of guns, through the mail. For some of the history buffs here, we may remember that John F. Kennedy was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald, who purchased the gun that he killed the president with via a mail order service. And so the country raised these questions and said that this is something that we can do to prevent this legacy of violence from being extended even further. When we look at 2010, one of the more recent years in which statistics are available, we see that there were about 16,000 homicides in the United States. We can see that fortunately, gun violence and homicides have been declining for multiple years. They're headed toward historic lows. But even at our historic lows, we still have more gun violence and more homicides than any other industrialized society, any other Western democracy. And so when we look at the change, the idea of change, which has kind of become so prominent in the era of Barack Obama's presidency, indeed it was the premise of his political campaign in 2008, we said, well, things have changed. I remember in 2008, at the beginning of the presidential kind of swing of the primary elections, I was in South Carolina, and I was living in Atlanta at the time, and I was dispatched by the Atlanta campaign headquarters in South Carolina to organize voters ahead of the South Carolina primary in February 26th of that year. And we encountered a very difficult argument for people who did not believe in voting for then candidate Obama. And this was among many African Americans, and we would walk from place to place and knock on doors and have this conversation multiple times. And this was a conversation with older black people who said that they could not in good conscience vote for President Obama because they had lived through what happened to Martin Luther King. And so when I talked to Congressman John Lewis about this, who was the president of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the only remaining person who spoke at the 1963 March on Washington, the only living person, he said that for that generation, they never actually recovered from having witnessed their aspirations dashed the way that they were on April 4th, 1968, when Dr. King took that tragic step out onto the balcony of the Lorraine Hotel. And our task as people who were going around organizing was to push people toward the idea that maybe our society, just maybe our society had changed enough that we could make this step, that we could actually step out on faith and make a vote and say that we believe this person can actually represent the country and we will not be held hostage to our fears. Barack Obama won that campaign in South Carolina and went on to win the Democratic primary. And it would be easy to take as a lesson from that that we'd moved beyond this point of assassination, that we'd moved beyond this fear of violence ending our political, as a part of our political life. But a more honest perspective of this, looking at this in 2014, is that we didn't end the culture of assassination. Instead, we democratized it. And so we see 16,000 homicides in 2010. We see last month, in December, a woman by the name of Renisha McBride, a 19-year-old young woman, was in a car accident in a community called Dearborn Heights in Michigan, and came out of the car accident in a dazed condition and knocked on the door of a stranger. And the stranger, late at night, opened his door, saw the person there, and shot her in the face with a shotgun. She died. We can't think of this as an isolated instance. Just a few months earlier, a young man by the name of Jordan Davis in Florida was in a vehicle a teenager was in a vehicle with several of his friends, and there became a conflict with a person next to them saying that the music was too loud, and the conflict escalated and gunshots were fired, and his life was ended tragically. None of us have forgotten about the travail and difficulty of watching the Trayvon Martin trial last summer and seeing George Zimmerman acquitted in a case in which one person had a weapon, one person had Skittles and iced tea. It was viewed that this was a valid case of self-defense. If we look in our recent history, is dotted by this legacy of violence. The shootings at the Sikh temple in Wisconsin, the 12 people who were killed and 70 people who were shot in Aurora, Colorado, the tragic shooting and near death of Gabrielle Giffords, Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords, and for those of us in the state of Connecticut, the searingly difficult and painful memory of what happened to the 20 children in Newtown, Connecticut, first grade students in Newtown, Connecticut, who lost their lives at the end of last year. So we understand this, and looking at what Congress understood in 1968, that we had to have a moment of self-awareness, that we had to search our souls and say, what are the implications for us as a society? And that was change. That was important and legitimate change. And yet we look at the fate of the background check bill that came directly as a consequence of seeing our society so dotted by such tragic violence, and saw that last year in April that it failed, that the bill, which would have proposed a modest change of more stringent background checks to determine who was allowed to have weapons, failed to win congressional approval. There was a second reform that came out of Dr. King's death and the fiery and chaotic urban uprisings that arose in the aftermath of his shooting. And that was Title VII, the Civil Rights Act, also known as the Fair Housing Act. And so, looking at what happened in the wake of Dr. King's death, President Lyndon B. Johnson said, the one thing that we can do is change the conditions that people are living in our cities. And so, excuse me. And so, in step with this, in line with this, Congress passed the Title VII Civil Rights Act in 1968, which forbade discrimination in housing and went a step further in saying that that the Federal Housing Authority would have the right to deny funding to any city or any community that practiced unfair housing practices on the basis of race, creed, or religion. This was a crucial reform, and for a moment it appeared that we might actually have a substantive change, another change, that we could look forward to in the wake of Dr. King's death. But there's a different story, and there's a complicated story, and it comes back to remind us exactly what happens when changes. The history of American housing is metaphorical, the history of unfairness in American society. When we look back at the history of American cities, most of our history has been defined by cities as places that were inhabited by elites, and people who were poor lived on the outskirts of cities or lived in rural communities far from resources, and people who had money lived close to the centers of cities where you would have all sorts of great housing options and theaters and so on. But by 1901, we begin to see some changes in American society, largely stemming from the vast increasing numbers and quickly increasing numbers of immigrants in American society, responding to things like industrialization and the huge influence of electrification of American cities. And so we began to see the rise of tenements and slums, places where the rising American working class would be housed, conditions that were not really fit for humanity. But in 1901, New York City did something that was considered to be pioneering and passed a housing law, the first tenement law in the country, that said that there would be requirements, that we would place a cap on the number of people who could live in a building at a particular time, that there would be a requirement that every room that every apartment have at least a window in it so people would have access to fresh air, that there would be a requirement that there would be courtyards, and so on. And so on, we began to see a reform movement that addressed the very common basic needs of human beings. But the problem with this reform was that it faltered along the lines of race. And so ironically, as we see American housing change and develop, that in the 1930s, the major reform in American housing is the establishment of housing projects, and I will tell you this and it will sound very strange. The concern in the 1930s was that African Americans were being excluded from housing projects. And there were, if you read the literature from the time, or if you read later kind of work, like James Baldwin, he writes about the resentment of people in Harlem and the fact that there are housing projects that are being built and African Americans are being kept out of them. In the post-war period, after World War II, we began to see American society changing in drastic ways very quickly in the suburbanization of the society. The National Highway Act, for instance, made it possible for people to live outside of cities. And so we always think that, things have always looked the way that they currently look, but they didn't. And so the 1957 Highway Act created a way for people to live outside of cities, and all of a sudden people could commute. And then there became a suburban revolution where the urban working class was able to move outside and own homes, the rise of Levittowns, the rise of places like Holiday Inn, which said that people can actually travel and stay in our hotels. And we began to see a suburban culture arise at the same time that we saw increasing numbers of Black Americans trapped in American cities. And so when we looked at the chaotic climate that came out of Dr. King's assassination, in many ways, these riots that dotted the country's landscape were a response to 20 years of people being trapped in the same urban conditions that were decaying as more and more people had access to suburbs. The NAACP, for instance, in its early history, one of the first things that it did was tackle housing. And this is kind of one of the things that's kind of an interesting issue here, that in 1917, one of the first things that NAACP accomplished was winning a case called Buchanan v. Worley. And so it's not something, I won't test you on this, but Buchanan v. Worley was a really important case because it struck down restrictive housing covenants. And so as immigrants came into the country and as larger numbers of African Americans moved into cities, people began to make laws and have contracts that said, well, we will build housing, but only certain people can live here. And this would be Blacks, this would be Latinos, this would be increasingly in very significant numbers Jewish American immigrants, and saying that we will not sell houses here, and this is completely constitutional. And this is a major accomplishment. But just 9 years later, this case is overturned, and what we have is the right to discriminate established in American law and verified by the Supreme Court of the United States. And it takes more than a half a century for these things to change. And so when we look at Renisha McBride and understanding this history, we can't help but to remember things like Dr. Ossian Sweet, who in 1925 was an African-American physician who purchased a home in Detroit, not very far from where Renisha McBride was shot, and his house was surrounded by a mob of people nearly forcing him out. He grabbed a weapon, began to shoot outside at the mob that was gathering. He struck one man who was killed, and he was arrested and charged with murder. He eventually was acquitted of this. But it explains to us that this dynamic of where people can live and what they can be has been a central conflict in American society, and one of the metaphors by which we can see how one of the indexes by which we can understand the degree of freedom we have. The post-war reforms created things like the Federal Housing Authority, which allowed people to have access to home loans. For the first time, owning a home became a basic right in American society. But between 1932 and 1964, 98% of the home loans that were approved by the FHA went to whites. And so what we came to understand was that there were two Americas, one that had access to the suburbs, one had access to homes, one that had access to an increasingly beneficial middle class existence in America, and one that was trapped in American cities. By the death of Dr. King, these tensions had reached a boiling point. So I mentioned at the beginning of this that there was a quote that we would talk about, and that quote came from Congressman J. Lister Hill. He said, "History aptly demonstrates that special privileges for one group can but result in a limitation of liberty and the denial of rights to others." He was speaking about the 1964 Civil Rights Act. He was speaking in opposition to it. What Congressman Hill from Alabama was arguing was that the right to discriminate was a fundamental right in American society, and saying that by creating civil rights laws, you would in effect be creating a special class of society that would have more rights than other people. On its face, it seems this is a ridiculous idea. When we look at the minuscule numbers of African Americans who were able to vote, the tiny numbers of African Americans who owned homes, the constant threat of violence that attended any attempt to participate in the political system. But this argument, as ridiculous as it may seem, and though it failed to prevent the passage of the Civil Rights Act, has retained a certain resonance. And it explains to us again what happens when change changes. So when we look at how the background check law of last year was defeated, when we trace the arguments that we heard in public, we would be tempted to believe that the most vulnerable class in American society is in fact those who are most heavily armed. We'd be inclined to believe, were we to read the Supreme Court opinions that came last summer in the case that eviscerated the Voting Rights Act, in which Justice Scalia said that racial entitlement of the Voting Rights Act was in fact discriminatory towards Southern states. Many of us may know that the Voting Rights Act came in 1965, prevented Southern states with a history of discriminating against black voters from continuing any of the practices that had eliminated black people from political life in those states. And what Justice Scalia said was that the Voting Rights Act, in effect, discriminated against Southern states. So we'd be tempted to believe, on the basis of these arguments, that America has a very long discriminatory history. It has a tradition of denying the rights and exploiting Southern whites. When we look at the ongoing legacy of racism in society, we kind of understand these things and saying, well, this is a tragic part of the American past. But a recent survey showed that more than 10% of white Americans believe the primary victims of racism in American society to be white Americans. And so the change that we sought has changed into a different type of change. One that verifies and upholds the very practices and principles that have been a barrier to American democracy, not just for African Americans, but for any group. We remember any group with a history of just being discriminated against. We remember the conversation that attended the lawsuits around marriage equality. And the arguments would have you believe that we have a long history of discriminating against heterosexuals in American society. And so this is the type of confusion that leads us to believe things like a rapper can take the Confederate flag and make it into apparel that's actually fun and useful. That's Kanye West, I'm sorry. It's like, just as a quick aside, no, I won't go down that road, but. And so, in looking at this, we have the most vulnerable in American society, gays and lesbians, immigrants, the poor, who are the primary victims in this increasingly unequal distribution of our wealth, the ongoing legacy of anti-Black racism, the difficulty of political participation, the most fundamental right to be safe in American society. And it would lead us to despair. But this is why we must go back to what Dr. King believed. It's important to recall that during his lifetime, he was at the midpoint of the changes that we take for granted now. Dr. King had no idea whether he was on a quixotic crusade to change a society that would never relinquish its addiction to racism, or if perhaps he was paving the way for a better American future. This is a person who knew from the time that he was 26 years old, when the first attempt on his life was made, that sooner or later there would be one that was successful. Yet he continued to push and continued to pursue this agenda. And what I think we can take from this is that history is on the side of those who are idealistic, that history is on the side of those who believe in change that can be permanent, that history is on the side of those who believe that when change changes, it can be changed back. What we should take from Dr. King's legacy is the belief that the levers of justice are within our hands, that we can move them in the direction that we see fit, and that the only obstacle to achieving Dr. King's vision is the false and comforting belief that we already have. Thank you.